It began in a neighborhood that on the surface looked like the picture of harmony. Sturdy fences divided manicured lawns, flowers bloomed in carefully arranged beds, and backyard decks echoed with the sound of barbecues on summer evenings. From above, it was the kind of community people envied, organized, peaceful, and close-knit. But beneath the surface, small cracks were already forming. And as anyone knows, cracks don't stay hidden forever. Two neighboring families stood at the heart of this story. At first, their homes looked like mirror images of each other, identical layouts, side-by-side fences, and matching patio furniture. They had lived side by side for years without much more than polite waves or occasional greetings. It wasn't friendship, but it wasn't hostility either. It was the quiet, polite distance most suburban neighbors settle into. That all changed one summer afternoon. The incident seemed minor at first. A new shed had been built in one of the backyards, its roof extending slightly over the property line. To the family who built it, it was nothing but a small convenience, an extra space for tools tucked neatly against the fence. But to the neighbors on the other side, it was a violation, a trespass into their territory. At first, they let it go, but each time they stepped into their backyard, the shed loomed there, casting its shadow across their flower bed. It felt intrusive, like an uninvited guest that refused to leave. The resentment grew quietly, like weeds beneath the soil. Then came the noise. Barbecues stretched later into the evening, music spilled over the fence, and laughter carried across the yards. What one family considered harmless fun, the other saw as disrespect. A backyard, once a place of retreat, became a battleground of irritation. It wasn't long before complaints began to fly, first whispered to the homeowners association, then muttered between other neighbors, and finally expressed in the form of photos, reports, and accusations. A line had been crossed not just physically with the shed, but emotionally with the constant feeling of intrusion. The HOA, as always, tried to mediate. Letters were sent, meetings were scheduled, but neither side was willing to compromise. For one, the shed was an innocent addition. For the other, it was proof that their space, their peace, and their rights were being ignored. The conflict that began as an argument over property lines soon seeped into every corner of their lives. Each new weekend brought fresh tension. Each summer day in the backyard carried the weight of hostility. The laughter of one family became the irritation of the other. The slam of a screen door became a challenge. And while the rest of the neighborhood watched from a distance, trying not to get involved, whispers spread. Everyone could feel the tension rising. It wasn't a matter of if the feud would explode. It was a matter of when. By the end of that summer, the first true confrontation had happened. Voices rose over the fence, arms gestured wildly, and though no words need be told here, the meaning was clear. This was no longer a disagreement. It was a war. The perfect neighborhood image was shattering, and in its place, something far uglier was beginning to grow.
The confrontation over the shed had left a mark that couldn't be erased. From that moment on, everything changed. The two families no longer viewed each other as neighbors. They were adversaries, locked in a quiet but relentless war. And like most wars, it didn't begin with a decisive strike. It began with small, petty battles. It started with the lawn. One morning, the grass clippings from a fresh mow were mysteriously blown across the fence line, scattering over the once pristine yard next door. The accused family insisted it was just the wind. The offended family insisted it was deliberate. Either way, the hostility deepened. Soon after, trash bins began appearing in suspicious places. One set out too far into the street, another accidentally tipped over near the other's driveway. At night, motion-activated sprinklers mysteriously turned on whenever one family walked too close to the fence. What could have been dismissed as coincidence became part of a growing pattern of suspicion. Then came the noise. Every weekend seemed louder than the last. Music blared from portable speakers, laughter carried late into the evening, and grills smoked until the air between the yards was thick with the smell of charred meat. For one family, it was celebration. For the other, it was torment. Windows slammed shut, blinds were drawn, but the resentment still seeped in. The backyard fence, once just a line of wood and nails, now stood as a symbol of hostility. Each side treated it as a wall in an invisible battlefield. Decorations were added, not for beauty, but for spite. Wind chimes placed deliberately to ring loudly in the breeze. Spotlights angled just right to shine into the other's yard. Flags flown proudly as silent taunts. The rest of the neighborhood couldn't help but notice. What had once been a peaceful block now carried a tension that hung in the air like humidity on a summer afternoon. Neighbors whispered about the feud in hushed voices. Some chose sides quietly, while others tried to remain neutral, though even neutrality seemed dangerous when tempers were so high. The HOA found itself drowning in complaints. Letters stacked on top of each other, each more dramatic than the last. Photographs of fences, noise logs detailing late-night parties, accusations of trespassing, all delivered with the same demand: do something about them. But the board knew better. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was about pride, and no letter could fix that. The turning point came on a bright Saturday afternoon. Both families were outside at the same time, each pretending to ignore the other, yet each fully aware of the other's presence. Tools clanged, grills hissed, and children's laughter floated through the yards. But beneath the ordinary sounds was a sharp undercurrent of tension. Then, like the strike of a match, it flared. One family's ball rolled across the fence line. The other picked it up and refused to give it back. It was a small thing, so small it would be laughable anywhere else. But here, in this war-torn backyard, it was the spark that lit the fire. What followed wasn't just a dispute, it was a spectacle. Gestures grew sharper, voices louder, movements more aggressive. Though dialogue is not told here, the posture and fury spoke volumes. Hands pointing accusingly, arms flailed, and both families stood at the edge of the fence as though it were a battlefield trench. And the neighborhood watched. From porches, from windows, from driveways, eyes turned toward the commotion. Phones appeared, cameras rolled, and whispers turned into gasps. The feud had finally boiled over, no longer hidden in emails and complaints, but visible for all to see. That day marked a shift. The feud was no longer private. It had become entertainment. As the sun dipped low and the shouting faded, one thing was certain. This wasn't ending anytime soon. The shed may have started the conflict, but now the entire backyard was a war zone. And every neighbor knew it was only a matter of time before things got even uglier.
The ball incident had pulled the curtain back. The neighborhood feud was no longer a secret whispered in quiet corners. It was public, visible, and impossible to ignore. And once pride had been wounded in front of an audience, there was no going back. The two families dug in, each determined to win. But this was no longer about a shed or even noise. This was about dominance. Who owned the fence line? Who controlled the block? Who would break first? It began with sabotage, small, deniable acts, each designed to send a message. One morning, a flower bed was trampled. The blooms, carefully tended for months, were crushed into the soil. When the owners stormed outside, the footprints led suspiciously close to the fence. On another day, trash appeared scattered across the lawn. A bag ripped open with its contents spilling onto the grass. Raccoons, one family claimed. Sabotage, the other declared. At night, sprinklers mysteriously went off, drenching freshly washed patio furniture. Motion lights flicked on and off, illuminating the backyard like a stage. More than once, neighbors claimed to hear the scrape of ladders, the sound of tools, the unmistakable hiss of spray paint in the dark. Whether the acts were real or imagined no longer mattered. Perception was enough to fuel the fire. The fence, the very thing that divided them, became a weapon. Boards were loosened, nails removed, and entire panels mysteriously damaged. On one side, accusations flew of intentional destruction. On the other, denials came just as fast. But the truth was irrelevant. Each broken board was another battle won or lost in the escalating war. The HOA was overwhelmed. Their inbox overflowed with complaints, each longer and more dramatic than the last. One letter accused the neighbors of trespassing. Another included photos of tire tracks, allegedly proof of deliberate vandalism. A third claimed psychological harassment, citing late-night music blasted directly out bedroom windows. Board members debated action late into the night, their patience wearing thin. But the problem was clear. Rules couldn't fix resentment. The HOA could issue fines, but no amount of money could buy peace between enemies. Meanwhile, the rest of the neighborhood was caught in the crossfire. Children were warned not to play too close to the fence line. Dog walkers crossed the street to avoid confrontation. What had once been a peaceful block now felt like a battlefield. Every neighbor forced to choose between ignoring the chaos or getting pulled into it. Then came the breaking point. One Saturday afternoon, the air was filled with the sound of laughter and the smell of smoke as one family hosted a backyard cookout. Dozens of guests gathered, music thumped, and the party spilled late into the evening. But on the other side of the fence, resentment boiled over. When the smoke cleared the next morning, chaos awaited. The grill had been tipped over, its contents scattered. Lawn chairs lay overturned, decorations slashed, and the fence bore fresh marks of damage. Whether it was the work of angry neighbors or reckless party guests didn't matter. Each side blamed the other, and by the end of the day, threats of lawsuits filled the air. The neighborhood, once divided quietly, was now openly fractured. Half believed the party family was reckless, antagonizing their neighbors with noise and carelessness. The other half believed the quieter family had crossed the line, resorting to sabotage out of jealousy and spite. And in the center of it all stood the HOA, powerless, overwhelmed, and facing pressure like never before. They couldn't ignore it any longer. Something had to be done. A special meeting was called. Notices went out. The community was summoned to the clubhouse. It was no longer about one shed or one fence or one party. It was about the future of the neighborhood itself. But what no one realized was that the meeting wouldn't be the end of the feud. It would be the spark that pushed the backyard brawl into its ugliest, most public chapter yet. The neighborhood had reached its breaking point. No one could ignore the feud anymore. What began as a quiet argument over a shed had grown into vandalism, chaos, and public humiliation. It was no longer just two families at war. It was a community being torn apart in the crossfire. And so the HOA called a meeting. The notice had been delivered to every doorstep in bold, urgent lettering. Special emergency session. Attendance strongly encouraged. By the time the evening arrived, the small clubhouse was overflowing. Folding chairs were lined against the walls, voices buzzed with speculation, and the air was heavy with tension. Everyone knew what the meeting was about. The two feuding families arrived separately, each followed by supporters who sat in clusters, glaring across the room like opposing armies. On one side, residents who were tired of noise, chaos, and parties. On the other, neighbors who had grown weary of complaints, sabotage, and endless drama. The divide was clear, sharp as the fence that had started it all. The HOA board members sat at the front, shuffling papers nervously, their faces pale under the fluorescent lights. They were volunteers, not judges, yet tonight they would have to mediate a war. The session began with order, but it didn't last. First came the accusations. Reports were waved in the air, photographs slammed onto the table. Voices rose, each angrier than the last. Property lines, noise complaints, vandalism and harassment, all laid bare for the entire neighborhood to witness. The feud that had once been hidden in emails and whispers was now on full display. Every raised hand was not just a comment, but a weapon. One side accused the other of deliberate sabotage. The other countered with claims of bullying and harassment. Dates, times, and proof were hurled like stones across the room. The board tried to quiet the storm, but the storm had already broken. Soon, the shouting began. Though no dialogue is repeated here, the atmosphere told the story. One family leaned forward, red-faced and furious. The other sat stiff, arms crossed, refusing to yield. Supporters shouted over one another, their voices rising until the room felt less like a meeting and more like a courtroom brawl. Phones came out, cameras rolled. What was supposed to be a controlled HOA discussion had turned into a spectacle, another chapter in the feud that the internet would later devour. And then came the breaking point. One resident, fed up with months of tension, stood and called out what everyone else had been thinking, that the feud was destroying the neighborhood for everyone, that while two families fought over fences and parties, everyone else lived under the shadow of hostility. The words cut through the chaos like a blade, leaving the room momentarily stunned. But silence didn't last. Both sides erupted again, louder than before, angrier than ever. For every accusation of sabotage, there was a counterclaim of provocation. For every complaint about noise, there was a reminder of harassment. The board, overwhelmed, finally threatened fines, lawsuits, and even legal intervention. But no one left satisfied. By the end of the night, nothing had been resolved. The board had promised further investigation. The families had left separately, their faces tight with fury. The supporters had gone home, muttering, choosing sides more firmly than ever before. The neighborhood itself was changed. Friendships strained under the pressure. Longtime residents avoided each other. Even the children felt it, warned to stay away from certain houses, told to keep quiet about what they had seen. The HOA had hoped the feud would end the feud. Instead, it had poured gasoline on the fire. Now both sides were angrier than ever, both sides determined to prove themselves right, and both sides ready to escalate in ways no one could have imagined. And as the days passed, everyone knew the next chapter of the backyard brawl wouldn't take place in a meeting room. It would take place where it all began, in the yards themselves, under the open sky, with the entire block watching.
The HOA meeting had left the neighborhood rattled. Instead of easing tensions, it had stoked them. The feud was no longer a private embarrassment but a public spectacle, and both families knew the whole community was watching. That knowledge didn't calm them, it only pushed them to dig deeper, to prove themselves right at any cost. The days that followed were filled with silence, but not the peaceful kind. Lawns were mowed in rigid, angry lines. Trash cans were slammed onto curbs. Lights flicked on and off in the night like signals in a battlefield. Every gesture was a statement, every movement a challenge. The air itself felt heavy, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. It happened on a bright Saturday afternoon. The sun was high, the sky clear, and the sounds of summer drifted across the neighborhood. Children played, dogs barked, and grills hissed with the smell of burgers. But beneath that ordinary surface, the storm was ready to break. Both families had chosen that day, unknowingly, to host gatherings in their backyards. On one side of the fence, music thumped, laughter carried, and guests lounged in chairs with cold drinks in hand. On the other, tools clanged, yard work continued, and every sound from next door seemed louder, more irritating, more personal. The fence once again stood as a thin, fragile barrier between them, a wall of wood separating two camps, each unwilling to yield an inch. It began with noise, music turned up louder, laughter ringing higher. Then came smoke, drifting over the fence from one grill into the other's yard. What might have been brushed off on any other day was taken as provocation. Guests muttered, tempers flared, eyes narrowed. And then came the breaking point. A ball once again crossed the fence line, but this time it wasn't returned. It wasn't ignored. It was hurled back with force, slamming into the ground hard enough to make everyone stop and stare. The tension, long simmering, finally erupted. Chairs scraped as people stood. Hands gestured wildly over the fence. Accusations flew, though no words are repeated here. The anger in their movements told the story clearly enough. Onlookers, guests, and neighbors alike rushed to the edges of the yards, some trying to calm things down, others raising their phones to capture every second. The confrontation grew louder, sharper, until one axe shattered the fragile boundary completely. A drink was spilled, or perhaps thrown. Liquid splashed across the boards, and in an instant, restraints vanished. The fence shook as hands grabbed at it, rattling the wood. Shouts filled the air. A chair toppled, followed by another. Guests spilled into the fray, trying to separate, trying to defend, trying to capture the chaos on their screens. The quiet suburban block had become the stage for an all-out backyard brawl. Though no dialogue is told here, the scene was unmistakable. Neighbors who once waved politely now faced each other like enemies. Arms flailed, feet stomped, the sound of splintering wood cracked as a section of the fence gave way. What had once been a neat division between 2 yards was now an open battlefield, grass torn, drinks spilled, and pride shattered. And the neighborhood watched. From windows, porches, and sidewalks, eyes widened in shock and disbelief. Some gasped, some cheered, and some simply filmed in silence, knowing this would spread far beyond the block. It lasted only minutes, but it felt endless. When it finally broke apart, the damage was clear. The fence was ruined, the yards were wrecked, and whatever chance of peace had existed was gone. Both families retreated, furious and humiliated, but the damage had already been done. The backyard feud was no longer just local drama, it was viral. The footage, shaky and grainy, spread like wildfire. Within days, the entire Pinternet was watching the meltdown of a neighborhood. Strangers debated who was right, who was wrong, and who had gone too far. For the neighbors living there, the reality was far less entertaining. Property was damaged. Fines loomed. Legal action was whispered about in serious tones, and in the middle of it all stood a community that had once prided itself on harmony, now reduced to hashtags and headlines. But the feud wasn't over. The backyard brawl was only the climax. What came next would determine how the story ended, with consequences, accountability, and the long road toward rebuilding, or with bitterness that would linger forever. The neighborhood braced itself. The war had gone public. Now the reckoning was about to begin.
The backyard brawl had ended, but its echoes lingered long after the shouting stopped. The fence lay splintered, furniture lay overturned, and the lawns, once trimmed and perfect, were scarred with the evidence of chaos. But the true damage wasn't physical. It was the fracture of trust, the shattering of a neighborhood's identity, and the stain of humiliation that would never wash away. The footage had spread far beyond the cul-de-sac. Within hours, the video of the fight appeared online, shared and reshared until strangers across the country were debating the feud. Headlines screamed of suburban chaos. Comment sections filled with jokes, judgments, and sympathy for the bystanders caught in the middle. What had once been a private war was now public entertainment. But the internet had the luxury of laughing and moving on. The neighbors did not. The HOA, under pressure like never before, was forced to act. Fines were issued to both families, the largest penalties the board had ever handed down. A formal letter warned that further incidents could result in legal involvement, even forced property liens. The families, already furious, now turned their anger toward the HOA itself. Police reports were filed. Each family accused the other of vandalism, harassment, and trespassing. What had once been complaints written on HOA letterhead were now sworn statements delivered to officers. Lawyers were consulted. Threats of lawsuits hung in the air like storm clouds. The battle that began with a shed now lived in legal documents, waiting to be fought in court. The rest of the neighborhood, meanwhile, suffered in silence. Children asked why they couldn't play outside. Parents whispered about moving, wondering if property values would plummet now that their street was infamous for all the wrong reasons. Friendships strained as residents chose sides or tried to stay neutral, only to find neutrality wasn't enough in a war that demanded loyalty. The two families rarely saw each other face to face anymore. The fence, though broken, was patched hastily, not as a gesture of peace, but as another contested line in their battlefield. Each side stayed within their boundaries, but the silence between them was heavier than the shouting had ever been. Time passed, but the bitterness remained. The HOA grew stricter, issuing new rules about noise, yard work, and gatherings. Parties became rare, outdoor laughter subdued. The very spirit of the neighborhood had changed. What was once a place of cookouts and camaraderie was now defined by suspicion and control. The feud had left scars that wouldn't fade. For outsiders, the story became another viral tale of suburban chaos, entertaining, dramatic, and soon replaced by the next spectacle. But for those who lived it, the backyard brawl was a wound that would never fully heal. Every glance at the patched fence, every sound of a lawnmower, every flicker of a motion light carried the weight of what had happened. In the end, neither family won. Both lost something far greater than pride. They lost the trust of their neighbors, the peace of their homes, and the dignity of their community. And so, the story of the backyard brawl became a cautionary tale, a reminder that sometimes the fiercest wars are not fought on distant battlefields, but over fences, sheds, and the fragile boundaries of suburban life. The neighborhood never forgot, and neither did the internet.